And thank you very much for giving me the chance to tell a story this evening. I very much enjoyed Beanie's story, so hopefully I can live up to that. I'm going to share my screen because I have a few pictures so that you will know what it is that I'm talking about in particular cases. So hopefully you can all now see that. So I've been, for the past 30 years, I've been living in two worlds. The world of non-human primates, like this baboon, like that's the chap on the left there, and as well as our own human world of when we are also primates. And so what I want to do is talk a bit about how living in those two worlds and how the work that I've done on the animals has brought me to think about weather in a different way. So I sort of start off talking about myself, and then it gets more interesting as I talk about monkeys. So I was brought up in a large city, the city of London, the capital of England. And weather somehow didn't ever really feature in my life. I didn't in any dramatic way or any way that I really felt I took a lot of notice of. You obviously couldn't predict the weather, except that, it would usually be grey and it would usually be raining. But there was no sense that it was something that was completely beyond your control. You weren't massively inconvenienced by it, and you sometimes had to make adjustments. But I never sort of felt the power of the weather in that way. And then I went to Uganda, to Kibale National Park, which is in the west of Uganda, to study grey-cheeked mangabes, which are these magnificent creatures here. You can see they're closely related to baboons. And they have these amazing mullet haircuts, as you can see. And they are tree-living species. So they are arboreal and they live high in the forest canopy. And so when I went to study these animals, I never really saw them clearly, and I never saw them for very long. And because they're so high up in the trees all the time, and you have to use binoculars to see them, and you mostly discover what's going on by what's going on up in the trees by what ends up falling down on your head. So that's mostly leaves and bits of fruit and things like that. Sometimes hard, quite painful seeds that bop off your head. And if you were if you're genuinely unlucky, various kinds of mangabe bodily fluids, but you would have a good idea, like indirectly, of what they were getting up to. And you didn't see the animals, and you also didn't see the weather. Often being in a rainforest weirdly feels like being indoors. You don't ever see the horizon. You don't really see the sky, so you feel like you're enclosed in this luscious green room. And changing the weather always used to take me by surprise. And that wasn't because there weren't clues available that the weather was going to change, but it was just that I was just really terrible at picking up on them. Or rather, I did pick up on them, but I completely failed to make the necessary connections, because I think it was because I was just such a city kid, and I wasn't someone who had spent that much time out of doors, really, during my childhood. My mum always tells this story that she can't believe this is what I do for a living. Because when my mum and dad first took me to the London Zoo as a very small child, about 4, and they, struggled all the way across London to get there. And we got into the gate, and the first thing I said once we were through the entrance was, "When are we going home?" So they're quite amazed that I've spent my life doing this kind of thing. So I was always being caught out when I was in the forest by sudden rainstorms. So the heavens would just, it's like God's shower is turned on, like the heavens just open, and these like stair rods of water just fall down on you, and you're completely soaked in a matter of seconds. And I would just always be stunned by this. I would always be surprised that all of a sudden it would start raining, and this is like 1 minute it's completely dry, the next minute it's this massive downpour. But there was a clue, and I did pick up on it, and I never made this connection that there would be this sudden, before a rainstorm, there's this sudden rush of wind through the forest, and you could hear it coming, and then it would hit you. And I would always say, "Oh, this is like being in the tube. This is like being on a tube station, like the subway in London. This is like when a tube train comes into the station. Oh, isn't that interesting?" And then 3 minutes later, I'd be completely soaked. And it took me far too long to recognize that this rush of wind and this change was heralding the arrival of the rain. So I certainly, it would have been very handy if that's something I could have latched onto earlier, and I'd have spent much less time being soggy. But it was at times like that when you're standing in the rain, you're soaking wet, the animals are soaking wet, and they have to get on with their lives and try and continue doing what they're doing, which is mostly finding food. And it really brought home just how hardy the monkeys were. They didn't turn a hair when it rained. The only ones who seemed to like be a bit disgruntled were the babies and juveniles, but the adults were entirely stoic. And I would, you know, at the end of the day, I would leave for home, like soggily leave for home. And I would often think of how, you know, the monkeys just can never escape the weather. And how hardy they have to be to survive in that environment. They're there all day, every day, in whatever the world throws at them, weather-wise. And it's hard not to sort of anthropomorphize under those circumstances. So anthropomorphism is this tendency we have of thinking about non-human creatures in very human terms. So this is just a good illustration of that. This is a vervet monkey, who I'll talk about in a minute. And he clearly looks exactly like the voice of his generation. He looks like Bob Dylan, but that doesn't mean that he is, you know, going to compose Blowing in the Wind and stun us all with his musical capacity. So we have to be very careful just when we see animals that look similar to us, that their thoughts and feelings are in fact like our own. And so in the case of the mangabes, I would always imagine like, oh, you know, they would really love to come home and have a nice, you know, as I was going off to dry off in my nice dry cabin and, you know, get nice and warm. And it would be really hard not to anthropomorphize and think that that's what the monkeys would always favor, and just realize that in fact their lives are so different. They have no concept that there is anything other than this, that of just being in the weather all the time is what life is all about. And then I mean, and that was sort of brought home to me again by, you know, when we moved on to study baboons in the Western Cape of South Africa, which I shifted to studying baboons following the completion of my PhD. And baboons are these very versatile monkeys. They're found in all habitats across the length and breadth of Africa, but they're generally open country species. So at our study site, it was on the coast in the Western Cape of South Africa, and the habitat was a mixture of open grassland and fynbos, which is a sort of low growing shrubby kind of habitat. And unlike in Uganda, because, you know, you could see the horizon all around and you could see the weather coming from miles away. So you could see rain approaching, you could see the rain falling far away and gradually getting closer and closer. And so having learned my lesson, I got extremely good at judging the right moment to like put on all my wet weather gear and to waterproof all my equipment, my recording equipment and my notebooks and everything like that. And I say waterproof, I just used to put them in a plastic bag. But it works. So, you know, you don't have to go too fancy. And again, the thing that struck me over and over again with the baboons was the sheer hardiness of these animals, because unlike in Uganda, where you're on the equator and you have a wet and a dry season, but you don't have much variation in day length and you don't have much variation in temperature. But as I say, our study site was on the south coast of South Africa. It's below the tropics. And if you were sort of to like swim off into the sea beyond our study site, the next thing you would reach would be Antarctica. So you've got, it's a bit like, the weather is a bit like, in some ways, very like here in Lethbridge. You have these hot, dry summers, and you can have these very, very cold winters where the temperatures would drop below freezing. And sometimes you'd even see snow. Sometimes it would even snow, which is not what you expect to find in Africa. And again, you know, it's this kind of, there's this tendency to anthropomorphize a bit. And as you're going home to your nice, and this time we'd upgraded and now we had like hot water and everything. So I could have a hot bath. I know you have a nice, dry, cozy house you can spend the night in. And then in the case of the baboons, I discovered that it wasn't so anthropomorphic after all. So one day, one of our students who was doing his PhD, Hallam, he came home from a day's babooning and he said, they've all gone down a hole. Is that normal? Have you seen that before? And we were like, they've gone down a what? They've gone down a hole. He's like, yeah, they've all gone like down a hole in the ground. They all just disappeared. And we're like, oh, you know, oh, Hallam's had a touch of the sun, and thinking he's gone a bit, you know, doolally. But it turned out that he was quite correct. And the baboons were sleeping in this hole in the ground. So, you know, we believed that that's what he said. And we all trooped out the next morning. And what we think happened was there was a new male immigrated into the troop recently, and because males move around different troops throughout their lifetime, whereas females stay in the troop they're born in. And Hallam said this new male had led them to this area of grassland where the troop never usually went, and they hadn't really, you know, ever visited it. And he led them right up to this hole in the ground, which was turned out to be the entrance of a cave system. And one by one, the baboons all like jumped down the hole and disappeared. And some of them were more reluctant than the others, but they all did it. And then Hallam said, the cave, everything went very quiet. And he realized that they weren't coming out again, that they had clearly gone to bed. They had clearly gone to sleep in this cave overnight. So the next morning we all trooped back, and the whole baboon team went to this hole. And we went very, very early because we were worried that if we might miss them, that they might have get up, or that they might come out of a different part of the where, if it was a cave system, because it's a limestone area, and the people on the reserve said, there's lots of caves around here. They could come out anywhere. So, but when we got there in the morning, there was just this huge column of steam, which is basically just like baboon breath coming out this hole. So we knew they were all still there. And then when the sun came up sufficiently that, the sun could get down into the hole, all the baboons just all sprung out of the hole again and got on with their daily business. So clearly monkeys do appreciate a nice, dry place to spend the night if they can get it, right? They're not, I'm not actually anthropomorphizing at all. And this was a thing of thinking about how flexible these creatures are and how they can sort them, they'll when they see an opportunity, they will take it. And also this notion of other animals having knowledge that can be transmitted within the group that otherwise they would never have known about. So the tradition of using the hole was established at the point that this male immigrated, and then continued through the entire 12 years that we were there working on the baboons. So once the baboon project finished, we moved to vervet monkeys, which are these lovely creatures. And this is where the issue of weather and the climate came more clearly to the fore, as the population we were interested in studying lived in an area of semi-desert that's known as the Little Karoo. And we first became interested in them when we would drive to our baboon site, which was a sort of 2-day journey from the university, where, so when I say we, I mean Peter Henzi, who I work with, and we formed a team to do this. And I'm also married to him, so it's a very lovely romantic story for another time. And we would stop overnight at this place called Croixfrenet. And as we drove on, we would see vervet monkeys sitting on fence posts and on the side of the road. And we would just think, what are you doing here in the desert? Because the thing about vervets, which makes them distinct from baboons and why it's thought they're not so widely distributed across Africa, is that they're meant to be much more water dependent and limited to habitats near watercourses and rivers. And they just weren't meant to be there in the desert. So as it turned out, they are water dependent, but they can live in the desert. In the sense that our population turned out to be living along a river system, but it was a river system that was very unpredictable, and it often dried up completely, and there was no water available. And the vervets that we would see by the side of the road, they were using artificial water sources that were found on farm land and things like that. So what we, again, we found the same thing, like as drought came to the area and the river dried up completely, we found out that they weren't quite as water dependent as they were meant to be. And they could go, so the monkeys could go for up to a month without any standing water in their territory, which was something that sort of begged belief, because we couldn't, they're quite small monkeys. They do live along rivers. Everyone says, well, they clearly are highly water dependent, but they're also clever and flexible. So what they were doing was they were moving up onto the hillsides where these succulent plants would grow, and they were getting their water from the succulents. So they would chew on the leaves of mother-in-law's tongue and other kinds of succulent, and they would suck the moisture out and they'd discard the rest of the leaves. And again, another thing is we found that the value of new animals moving in and out of the groups and the way they bring new knowledge. So, and again, a male immigrated into the group, and this is when during the period of drought, and this male one day immigrated in because there were females available to mate with and all that kind of stuff. And then one day but it was very, very dry. And he just got up and walked off, and the other animals followed him, and he led them out of their territory and around all the other territories. And we were just completely bewildered as to where we might be going. And then we arrived at a cliffside, and we walked to the edge of the cliff, us and the monkeys, and we looked down, and there were these standing pools of water in the riverbed. And there were also some holes that had clearly been dug by baboons that were also water filled. And all the vervets ran down into the bed, and, you know, all drank their fill, and then the little ones were all playing, and, you know, play is very determined by environment. So we hadn't seen these babies play for, you know, months, and then all of a sudden they had a drink and they were quite happy and they were playing around, and they continued to use that site every day until the drought ended. And then in subsequent years, the male who had taken them to this site, he left the group again. He vanished. Either he left to another group or he died. And we just wondered, when the river dried up, it's like, are they going to know? How will they know how to get there? The male who knows the way is gone. And in fact, the females, a group of females, a dominant female and her, led the monkeys back to this site. So clearly this knowledge had been transmitted through the years and was now sort of in the troop. So that just highlights one of the values, and this is the thing I'm interested in, that one of the values of group living is the ability to transmit knowledge to others, and that allows animals to cope with unpredictable events in it that may extend beyond their lifespan, that you can keep knowledge in a group in that way. And we're primates too, and I hope that we can also call on our, you know, the knowledge that we have sustained in our groups, and call on various kinds of traditional knowledge and people who know about these things to help us deal with the climate challenges we're increasingly going to face in the future. So thank you again for your attention, and thanks again to Lisa for inviting me to tell my story.